Hi, Chris. Really good to see you. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this podcast. How are things going with you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Yeah, can't complain. Down in South Wales, the sun's out. So yeah, that's a good start to my day.
Fantastic. I want to jump straight in and like often on podcasts, people talk about, where they've come from, a bit of their journey and where they are now. I'd like to do the same thing, but I want to focus on your leadership journey really and how that's kind of been interwoven through the various roles you've had right from the start through your career to where you are now. So if you want to talk us through where you come from, where you are now, with a slant on leadership. That'd be great.
No, thanks, Pete. I mean, yeah, I guess I've had a little bit of a reflection. I had a bit of a reflection moment actually during lockdown, and I wrote a piece on my 25 years in coaching at the time, which is now 4 years ago. So now I'm 29 years into
Wow.
performance coaching and leadership. And I guess if you take it all the way back to the beginning, pulling the lessons in terms of leadership out of that journey, I guess what I would probably say, in all honesty, would be experiential learning, exposure to tons and tons of kind of performance environments, and along that journey, I guess exposure to really influential and inspiring characters, whether they were from a coaching standpoint kind of player groups, or whether from a coaching standpoint it was other coaches within those performance environments, and I guess the network that I developed and kind of nourished over the 29 years. So I guess it's pretty, I'd say it's organic, it's probably quite authentic, and it's probably quite experiential, as opposed to, I guess, targeted leadership skills that you may or may not have gone on professional development courses to develop. It would much more be about environments and how those environments have shaped me as a person, practitioner, and essentially now in more leadership roles, a kind of leader as well. I think that's probably the best summary of it all.
Yeah, no, that's great. So what has that journey looked like? Like where did you start and what kind of roles have you had along the way?
Yeah, multiple's the answer to that. But in essence, if we want to take it right the way back, which it does obviously have implications, failed professional sports person, or failed wannabe professional sports person, had real ambitions to play sport at professional level when I was in my teens and into my early 20s. Never really materialised, but I guess the junction point there would have then been going into personal training to start with, which was a really, really incredible, I guess, foundational skill that I've taken into my kind of professional sports coaching roles. But more on that later potentially. So
Yeah.
a personal training route. I will hasten to add, pre-internet. So this is how far we're going back in the world. So I essentially started my performance coaching journey in personal training. I then my actual first speculative application into working in professional sport was with Leicester Tigers, at a time when Leicester Tigers were a pretty good sports organisation. 7 or 8 England players who went on to win Rugby World Cup in 2003 were part of that programme, and there's some leadership lessons to take out of that particular job. But I started at Leicester Tigers in 2002 as an academy S&C coach. A little bit of internal conflict, I guess, and internal change management went on when Dean Richards, a fairly famous England rugby coach, got sacked because Leicester Tigers only ended up sixth in the Premiership, and that wasn't deemed as good enough. A ton of senior leaders left the organisation at that point, and I did one more season as I guess, a strength and conditioning coach across both academy and first team kind of performance programs, both in the men's program anyway. And then I left to go to South Wales through some personal kind of, I guess, challenges, and did 9 years in Cardiff Blues, which is now Cardiff Rugby. Multiple roles in that particular organisation. Started out in the Blues Academy working with the developmental program, and I ended up doing 3 years there and 6 years as senior strength and conditioning coach with the first team. Again, that was a kind of really, really interesting learning experience for me. Pulled a ton of lessons out of that particular experience, so I'd like to go and revisit that if we have if we obviously make that some of the meat
Yeah,
and potato in the meat and potatoes of,
definitely.
I get my personal development journey, but also what I learned from a leadership standpoint and the lessons there. as with all things, good things must come to an end, Pete. I did 9 seasons at Cardiff Rugby. Really enjoyed it. I will say a sort of change in coaching personnel and I guess, difference of alignment led me to kind of choose a different path for the next 10 years of my life. I'm fortunate to have married an American. That was not by design, but by accident and old-fashioned values of love. And we ended up going to the US in 2014. I worked for a commercial, a commercial business that was looking to really make an impact on the rugby landscape in North America, and that had high levels of connectivity with USA's national teams. And I happened to meet a man called Peter Steinberg. Again, I'd like to go back and revisit that particular moment in my life. Pete, at the time, 2014, 2015, had a profound influence on my career when it came to the leadership lessons. So I'd really like to go back to that particular moment in my
Yeah.
life. Personal reasons. We had a baby in America, and my wife's family are pretty much based in South Wales. We decided, and also Donald Trump at the time got elected for the first time. Family decision was to relocate back to the UK. 2016, I worked in professional cricket and had a fabulous one-season wonder. Northamptonshire County Cricket Club. Plenty of lessons learned in terms of people management, leadership, and I guess understanding the complexities and the dynamics of that particular sport. Really, really like profound lessons again. Head coach Dave Ripley had an influence on my kind of, I guess, my journey from then on in. And now fast forwarding through multiple kind of roles, which included a little dip into the University of South Wales and lecturing in strength and conditioning alongside some coaching responsibilities. I'm in a new sector now. I've kind of gravitated away from sport, but still work in high performance. And there's absolutely some valuable lessons to learn in my current role as a performance manager in the military.
Wow, fantastic. I mean, that really was a whistle-stop tour of 29 years, but thanks for sharing that. I know you said there's a few things you want to go back to, which we will, but I like what you said about your experiential learning being exposure to environments and exposure to different people, and you've clearly had a lot of that. So let's go back to Leicester Tigers Academy S&C coach. What were some of the lessons you learned during that time when you were there?
I think that the biggest thing, Pete, to pull out of that time was, I guess, the behaviours, the values, and the work ethic of the people. And I know that sounds a little bit fluffy, but the realities of what leadership looked like at that particular moment for me was the England captain, if for those who don't know, Martin Johnson, a fairly kind of imposing figure at 6'8" and actually a man of few words, but a man who would, through values, behaviours, and instilling an element of, shared work ethic, would actually do the talking on the field most of the time, but also that would then translate into the behaviours and the standards that were expected off the field. So even though, I mean, obviously he was a senior leader in the team, he was also a senior figurehead and a leadership figure for the club as a whole, and that was about standards and behaviours. And so from there, it was almost the kind of organic, expectation that in that particular time and in that particular environment, there would be certain standards that the senior player group particularly would uphold. And I think
Yeah.
some of the lessons that I learned from my reading around leadership with a guy called Paddy Upton, who I'm sure I'll talk to you about as well, who had, again, another fairly influential character that I've never actually met, but some of the concepts and some of the ideas that he brings to performance were all about collective intelligence. And I'll bring that up on numerous occasions because it did have a fairly heavy influence in my kind of thinking around performance from when I first talked and listened to him on podcasts and online and all that other type of stuff. But going back to Jono, it was those expectations and those shared values and that, I guess, powerful influence on others that shaped how to kind of, I guess, present yourself as a professional and integrate into a team whereby shared values, those strengths of character, allowed you to have, I guess, better conversations with people who may or may not have required influence at the time. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think it's great. It's really good that you're able to look at the situation and pull out real specifics around what is a leader made up of. And you've talked about, behaviors and values. You've talked about this work ethic and shared values, and then all that together being able to have a powerful influence on others. So it's really helpful for our listeners to understand, what underpins leadership, and obviously the stuff that you saw in Jono and the way he conducted himself had a an impact on you. Just going back to Paddy Upton, then, can you talk a little bit more about him and what you've got from him, and where we can find out more about some of his work?
Yeah, no. So Paddy Apton's a performance coach who's South African. He went to India from a cricket perspective, and he talked about personal mastery, and ultimately the journey to sort of journey of enhancement is a never-ending one. But that was one of the key things. But the other thing that really struck me absolutely and struck a chord with me as a coach who historically had athlete facing, player facing interactions, he coined the phrase collective intelligence, which essentially means everybody in an organization has a valued voice and has valuable, I guess, intelligence that allows the team or the organization to function as optimally and as effectively as possible. And in a sporting context, what that essentially meant was, and I can bring back many, many examples of how this has really influenced the way I coach and the way I interact with people across all strands that I now work across, is that every single person, and most importantly, and this was a big turning point for me in my career as a coach, the player group, especially the player group who plays at international and elite level, has probably the most important voice when it comes to shaping the culture, the team, the identity, the playing philosophy, understanding the demands of the sport at the highest possible level. And it goes back to the Theodore Roosevelt quote around the man in the arena. The man in the arena had a massive influence on how I behaved when I got to know the right people in various organisations. And Leicester Tigers would have been one of those organisations. The other one was absolutely Cardiff Blues when I got to the senior team. And some of the leadership qualities that I saw in some of the players really drew those things out, that the playing group, without a shadow of a doubt, some of them are the most important people within an organisation from a sporting context. Yes, of course, there's business and there's other organisations across the world that may or may not operate slightly differently. But the one thing I've always done from around about, I would say, 2007, 2008, so going back, a fair few years, is listen before I speak, because what the people who I'm talking to have got to say has to be considered when you think about building a performance program that's going to service those people that are speaking to you. And I think that was one of the most powerful moments in my coaching career, where I'd gone from a relatively, I wouldn't say autocratic leadership style, but when you're working with academy age group players and you've got a level of, I guess, subject matter expertise, you're the one dominating planning and implementation of programming from a coaching standpoint. When you've got an international player standing in front of you who may be nearly 30 or maybe over 30 and has got between 50 and 100 test caps, my mentality switched when I met the right people to, what can I learn off you so that I can implement better programming across the spectrum of players that may be in their first year of professional sport or in the latter end of their professional careers. And that was a really, really powerful lesson for me, Pete. I met 5 or 6 people at Cardiff Rugby, some Kiwi lads, some Welsh lads, who literally really helped change the way I dealt with communication, listen, make more observations before you go jumping into, this program that I'm going to write for you is going to change and solve all your problems, to actually, how can I serve you better by listening and integrating your feedback and your thought process into the performance preparation matrix. And that essentially was a massive turning point in my career, where now this shared ownership of performance and programming in the coaching context was born out of not only Paddy Upton's collective intelligence model, but also players having a really, really big influence on the way I approached goal setting, feedback, and inevitably writing better programs that suited their needs, and not me trying to fit my square peg into their round hole.
Yeah, no, that's there's so much there, and that's fascinating to hear, the different things that have had an impact on you, and particularly the fact that the player group has such an important voice in shaping culture, because we often look at, it's the responsibility of the head coach and the leaders and the staff, which it is to some extent, but also if you lose that playing group, then you're not going to have the right culture. So I think the fact that they have that impact on the culture as well is so important.
Genuinely, I really believe this, Pete. Alignment to a vision requires all stakeholders to be fully invested, and
Yeah.
that is genuinely effective communication across the whole pathway, and that is from the kit man, who in some clubs is probably the most important voice, believe it or not, to the chef, to the social media people, to the most junior of player, to the most senior of executive leadership. I genuinely believe that cohesive alignment to share the performance kind of program requires every single person to be aligned and on the same page, and it's not an easy job. And there's a lot of places, and you'll know this as well through your years and years of experience in performance sport. There's a lot of people who may or may not align on the mission, but there's also a lot of people, when they do, that you can really see a flourishing organisation, and an organisation that has, I guess, legacy success. Saracens in professional rugby in England would be one that springs to mind for me, and I've only ever been in there as a guest and not as someone who's worked in there full time. But it seems to me like there really is a collective approach to the key goal. I mean, the historical kind of All Blacks legacy, for example, is one where the tip of the spear is the All Blacks, and everybody in New Zealand from grassroots through is aligned with making sure that the All Blacks legacy remains. And I know they're not necessarily world ranked number one at the moment, but the general premise is that from bottom to top and top to bottom, that everybody is making sure to the best of their ability that the national team is still the figurehead of the sport, and it will be for decades and centuries to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've talked a little bit about your journey, obviously, in the different areas where you've been impacted by different groups you've been in, different leaders you've worked with, playing groups, influential players. I'd like to look at you as a leader as well, because in all these roles, you've brought leadership yourself, whether it's an academy role, a senior team role that you've had plenty of. Where can you think of any examples where your leadership has had a particular impact on the organization, or what, kind of whatever's happening around you at that time?
Yeah, I mean, this takes me back very nostalgically to the sort of 2016 Northamptonshire County Cricket Club experience, and I only did spend a year there for various reasons, but I would suggest, Pete, again, this is a massive turning point in my career, where I'd gone from sports that essentially require high levels of physical prowess. I worked in collision sport. I worked in professional rugby for a long, long time before I ended up going to the county cricket for this one season. But the day I arrived for the first day of pre-season, I remember it was the first week in January. It was freezing. It was dark. It was probably 8 o'clock in the morning. I arrived for my first day at work, and I just sensed straight away that I was going to be up against an enormous challenge, where you've got very highly skilled. You've worked in county cricket, which is why I can see you smiling.
Yeah.
I was up against, or I sensed that I was going to be up against a very highly skilled group of people who didn't necessarily value, and given that I'm going in as a strength and conditioning coach here, just to caveat that, I just had a sense that the people didn't necessarily value and take strength and conditioning that seriously. And at the end of the first week, with a little bit of pushback, not a little bit of pushback, with plenty of pushback from players in terms of just effort, in terms of compliance, in terms of attitude, I thought, if I don't grab hold of this quickly, this is going to be I'm going to have a miserable time in this particular environment, because I'm used to players who value strength and conditioning, who value developing physical prowess. And here I've got people who don't mind practicing in the nets for hours and hours and hours on end, but you ask them to do some structured physical development work and it's kind of like 15, 20 minutes, half-assed effort, that type of thing, which is going to be a challenge when you, like I say, when you come from a background of, players who really do value the gym and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, the good thing about this particular environment was that the captain, was big into his vanity weights. So I was okay. There's something to latch onto. The captain doesn't mind coming to the gym to do chest and arms. So I'm like, okay, we'll gravitate to what they like doing. And I'm sure you've heard loads and loads of coaches talk about this type of thing in the past. We'll gravitate to what they like doing, and then over time we'll slowly influence the people who like going to the gym to pull the peer group. And this is where the player power thing always comes in, and this is where this collective intelligence model is really valuable. Player power or peer-to-peer pressure is much more powerful than a coach demanding and telling you, you must come to the gym at this time, and you must do this, and you must do that, and you must do the other. But if players are influencing other players to be more compliant, to be more diligent, to give a little bit more effort, it's much more of a powerful messaging tool. So I think the really exciting thing about this challenge was, one, build relationships with the key influencers, and that remains to this day. Two, listen, which is where I went back with the feedback and the coaching kind of experiences I'd had at Cardiff. Listen to what they want. And if in the initial instance, which may or may not be best practice, they just want to do a little bit of watt bike intervals and sit and chit chat in the gym, let that happen. Because they're actually in the place where you want them to be. They might not be doing what you want them to do, but they're in the place where you want them to be. So if they're in the gym, it at least gives you the chance to build a relationship and have a conversation and get to the bottom of what the player why looks like. I always call those initial feedback meetings or those one-to-one consultations, establish the player why. And once you can establish the player why, you can then, with your technical expertise, build a program that sits in their ownership quadrant to the point where I've given you what you want because you've identified your player why. So now that I've identified your player why, or you've identified your player why, and I've aligned my programming expertise with what you want, then we can meet halfway and you can actually do the stuff I write for you. That was one of the ways to influence a level of compliance and a level of value and a level of enhancement when it comes to physical performance. The other thing that worked really well at one point in time, and this takes a little bit of time because you have to build effective relationships first, is relatively frank discussions around, and you have to be a relatively comfortable coach and a relatively comfortable person with this particular approach, and I'll share it with you, I don't mind. I had a fairly frank conversation with two relatively senior players, which kind of went along this line, which was, I'm available to help you and support you in your goals. And I'm trying not to swear. And I'm not really that bothered. And I basically said, I'm not really that bothered if you show up to the structured training times that I've set out in the weekly schedule. Because essentially, I am available to help you. If you don't want my help, that's absolutely no problem. I'll help the boys who want my help. But one thing that will be very explicit at the end of season report will be, when it came to compliance and we're talking about head coaches and we're talking to head coaches and we're talking about your feedback review and we're talking about your contract negotiations, I will be explicitly honest about your compliance to strength and conditioning and how many sessions you turned up to and how many you didn't. So I don't care if you come and I don't care if you don't. But what I will do is be there to support you when you're ready to be supported. And that with these two particular senior players was a relatively powerful conversation, and it was on the balcony at the ground that I worked at the time. And I saw these two boys looking at each other going, he cares and he wants to support us as best he can, but also he doesn't give a shit if we ignore his advice. And it's like, and that was a strong, powerful message from my point of view, that I am, in terms of leadership styles, relatively servant in that respect from a strength and conditioning standpoint. I'm looking to empower players to own their performance. I'm looking for anyone actually to empower them to own their own performance, because whether you're a CEO, whether you work in the military or whether you work in sport, you have to own your own performance. And that essentially requires support staff, which a coach or a performance director or any sort of role in a support system would be. But you've also got to stand up for some of your own personal values and go, do you know what? I'm here to support you. If you don't want my support, fine. You'll come and find me at some point in time, and that's absolutely fine. And I'll deal with the other 16 or 17. And I think, Pete, genuinely, that year, we went from kind of 3 or 4 giving a shit about S&C to probably, I wouldn't say all players, because some players still didn't care at the end of the season, but 95% of players went to another level from a physical development standpoint in that year with, I guess, effective relationship building, feeling like their voices had been heard when it came to the individual development plan. And it wasn't just about me being an S&C coach and ticking a box. It was actually me caring about them as an individual player. And then the compliance to the programming went through the roof as a result of that as well. Don't get me wrong, I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head what the injury stats were, because cricket's pretty arduous when it comes to fast bowling particularly. But in terms of general, I guess, compliance, diligence, professional standards, all of those things, effective relationship building, effectively listening to what the player group wanted and needed and delivering on that, was the difference between me personally having a miserable time in that cricket season to me having a great time and us winning a relatively high profile trophy at the end of the season. So it was a harsh lesson, but the one other big thing that was really, really important was that I had the support of the senior coaches, and I did, I guess, harness the support of the senior player group so that players, coaches and support staff were all pretty much pulling in the right direction and in the same direction. So it was a real kind of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach to getting players to basically do stuff they didn't want to do.
Yeah. I mean, that is a fantastic lesson in how to get non-compliant people to be compliant, but also how to genuinely influence people. But what I like is that it comes from a position of you wanting to help them, and but also not just being a sort of a pushover that, yeah, I want to help you, but I'll do everything on your terms. No, you're still holding your standards of, I want to help you on your individual performance plan, and here's my rationale to really help you be the best you can be, but you need to buy into the program. So it's that nice balance that you seem to have from between being able to, withhold your standards but get people to buy in and be personal with them and listen and care about them.
I think so, Pete, and I think that's a key lesson. And any young coach listening, I hope, will take one thing away from this podcast, would be you've got to be able to hold yourself to high account as well and to high standards. And don't get me wrong, you've been around the performance block as long as I have, and there's ego around every corner. And listening is way more important than speaking. And ultimately, having a backbone is also really, 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 really important. and not being
Mm.
intimidated by the profile of sports people, particularly. And I know people may be working in various levels of sport, but I mean, my first day at Leicester Tigers, and this is a genuinely true story, my first day at Leicester Tigers, the first person who came to step on the jump mat for pre-season assessment was Martin Johnson. He's 6'8". He's towered over me, but ultimately, at the time, I was a slightly older, more experienced coach because of my pathway into professional sport. I wasn't sort of straight out of school or straight out of university. I had, I guess, a level of kind of comfort around, building relationships with, high net worth individuals, or personal training. Going back to that first part of this conversation, personal training gave me a
Yeah.
really, really important grounding in social skills, and I guess to some degree like self awareness. And I'd personal trained, I mean, company executives and business owners, and in the money side of it doesn't really matter. But I trained a guy who was a founder of a 9-figure business, and so I was comfortable
Mm.
in working across a broad spectrum of kind of humans. And so Martin Johnson could have really intimidated me at 6'8" and towering over me. But he stepped into my domain. We're doing some physical performance profiling for a start, so I kind of know what I'm doing. But it was also having that, I guess, that strength of character, Pete, to be comfortable in my own skin, to basically, be the one asking the questions at that particular moment, and not being sort of, oh yeah, my knee's sore, I don't fancy jumping today. It's a fine balancing act, but I think it is about being comfortable in your own skin, and obviously a level of competency as well when it comes to the confidence you build from having a level of subject matter expertise, I suppose. But also, yeah, to the main point of this little segue would be, yeah, don't get bent over by players, but you've got to be able to listen. But you've also got to be able to counterpunch if you need to, with, a sound rationale for why you're wanting to do something. I had many an
Yeah.
argument, Pete. I had many an argument with players, but but they were born out. They were born out of searching for performance enhancement. The methods may have been different, or the way that people wanted to approach would have been different. But the fact that I actually listened and made informed decisions on various methodologies that would inevitably influence my programming structure going forward as well. There's a guy in Cardiff who was a Kiwi boy called Xavier Rush. Xavier Rush, if you ask anybody, would have probably been one of the most, was probably the best overseas signing that Cardiff had made in the history of the organisation at the time. Week in, week out, showed up and got the job done on game day. But the way he approached training and performance in the preparatory weeks was very, very different to other people. And you could either dismiss that as kind of, oh, he's just a n=1 outlier, or you could actually ask him kind of for his rationale for why he did things. And he was the first person who really influenced my program design when it came to things like heavy sled toes, which is going back years and years and years, Pete, way before JB Moran and all
Mm.
those guys validated it in the research. But it was one of those ones where listening, seeking to understand a player's perspective, taking the time to talk away from the kind of pressures of, game day, or away from the pressures of the training ground, and actually getting to know people and getting to understand their player why, actually had real profound influence on my kind of, I guess, programming philosophy, as well as my kind of coaching philosophy at the same time. That's where I think that leadership piece for me was all about, being more proactive when it came to listening.
Yeah. Yeah. No, great example. Great example. I mean, we've looked at some of these challenges that you've had along the way. Can you think of any other examples or situations where you've really just made an impact? Something that you've done, some leadership you've brought, a decision that you've made, some guidance that you've brought that has really impacted the organization?
Um, I guess maybe going back more recently to my time in Major League Rugby. I mean, Seattle Seawolves are a reasonably experienced or a reasonably well-established program when I took over there. 2019, we did have the bit of the drama of that thing, COVID, which seems to have been and gone. But I guess from my perspective in that particular organisation, one of the keys would be having, I guess, the foresight, or the kind of, the foresight to just challenge senior leadership when it came to resourcing, for example. So historically, performance teams in a sport where, in the UK particularly, you've got tons and tons and tons of like staff supporting the playing groups. In Major League Rugby at the time, I'd say it was being a skeleton. And I think
Mm.
the biggest thing that I really championed when I got to Seattle, in my second season especially, was the integration of various, I guess, performance practitioners. So I know it might sound stupid for those who are used to kind of an interdisciplinary department having S&C coaches, sports scientists, nutrition, psych intervention, psych skills, whatever it might be. I think one of the things I really did when I got to Seattle in the second season that I was there was basically push for an integrated model, and push for enhancement in human resources. And I know that might only be a small thing for teams who are used to big departments, but going from basically me in the performance department to having a mental skills coach, a nutritionist, and a sports scientist made an absolutely massive difference when it came to the support system around the player group. And it was something where I literally had to kind of put a business case. Well, I did have to put a business case towards it, and really, I guess, demonstrate the value of three new heads in the performance department that's going to make a difference on the field, and the support
Yeah,
system
I was
around
going to
it.
ask
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Sorry,
Go on,
carry on.
go on. No, go on.
No, no, I was going to say, I was going to ask you how you did it, but you said, well, you put a business case towards it. I guess you had to win them over and sell your case, didn't you? You had to pitch to them, basically.
Yeah, I mean, do you know what I did? I took the EIS. I know the UK Sports Institute now. I took the EIS kind of what it takes to win model to them. I adopted it more
Mm.
specifically towards rugby, but I basically took a model that I'd seen in the UK and presented it in the US to say, do you really expect? And they did have a level of success before. Well, they won the inaugural Major League Rugby title, and they won it the year after. But I mean, Major League Rugby in America, just for context, is what I would call a startup league, where it's evolved year on year, and it's only 6 years old, 7 years old now. And there was a lot of evolutionary change across the whole league, let alone just an individual team. But to the point, I literally took a business case to them saying, do you really expect to remain competitive with basically a skeleton staff that can't literally support the player group to the level that's required to sort of sustain high performing kind of humans on the field? And that was it was. But again, Pete, going back to the sort of multiple stakeholders piece, I was comfortable sitting in front of ownership groups, chief executives, senior leaders, and even as a guy who historically has worn a tracksuit for the last 29 years, I guess I've developed the skills to be comfortable talking to a billionaire and the cleaner in equal measure. And that ultimately is the true story. One of the owners is living in that
Mm.
living in a different world to us. But the realities are, you've got to still be comfortable in your own skin to have relatively difficult conversations with people of power and people of influence. And I think that comes with that experiential learning and experiential developmental, I guess, exposure to people. And that's, the 29-year journey. I've learned something along the way.
Yeah, no, that's good. I just lost you for a second there. I think I've got you back now.
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just
No,
dropped
that's
out.
good. You've talked about a few different models like collective intelligence, and you mentioned the EIS, what it takes to win model. I wanted to ask you, are there any frameworks or models or anything that you use from leadership that has really helped you, um, frame the way that you do things, the decisions you make, or has really helped you adopt a particular style? Or have you got any rules of thumb that you go to when you think, right, I need to follow this structure that has kind of helped you along your leadership journey? Have you got anything you can think of?
I wouldn't say I've necessarily taken any models from any particular area, but one thing, and it's a very pertinent. I remember the day to this day because it's my sister's birthday. and just bear with me, it might be a long story. So the 14th of October 2012,
Go for it.
Felix Baumgartner jumps out of the sky from 126,000 feet. And it's my first exposure to Red Bull high performance, and not just a sporting context where winners and losers on a Saturday afternoon was the be all and end all of my life at that particular moment in time. So from that moment on, that was the 14th of October 2012, I became super, super curious around human performance, and not necessarily just in a sporting context. But I guess the moral of the story was it was my first real exposure to kind of the Red Bull high performing kind of model, which is encompassing all those things that kind of, I guess, get weaved into the collective intelligence model. But the one thing that came out of my kind of, I guess, investigations and my curiosity around that particular time in my life was Red Bull Wing Finder. I'm sure you're aware of it, which is the kind of
Yeah.
personality assessment. And I guess, Pete, to answer your question, self-awareness and doing some of those personality assessments, not just the Red Bull Wing Finder, but others, insights, for example, and there's others that are obviously out there for people who go into recruitment and all sorts of other things. But I think that was the catalyst for change when it came to self-awareness and understanding myself, which then allows you to translate what you know about yourself into the workplace and into those performance environments, and have an awareness that here's a strength of mine, here's a weakness of mine, how am I going to manage this particular circumstance? I used to, well, I don't, well, yes, I will say I used to. I was brought up in South Africa. I had a very red, fiery temper. At times, I'd like lose my shit. I'd still lose my shit in some of my early coaching interactions with various people. But I genuinely believe over the last 12 to 14 years, particularly, I've spent a lot of time, I guess, understanding my own self, which then translates to being better in stressful situations where I can count to five. I would say I've got a little bit more emotional intelligence to just take a breath, just take stock of a situation, and maybe deal with it better now than I would have done in the past. And I think that then allows you to be a better and a more effective leader when you do consider both sides of the argument, you do consider somebody else's frame of reference, and you do consider somebody else's map of the world, and you try to rationalize that as well as you can and assimilate all those, I guess, subject areas that may or may not be causing a level of conflict, and actually deconflict by, I guess, firstly understanding yourself more and knowing that if something's going to trigger my rage, I've got to just keep that in check, because you don't really, as a leader, want to be kind of losing it every 2 minutes and getting frustrated. But there's times when you've got to push, and there's times when you've got to pull, and there's times when you've got to hold, and there's times when you've got to revisit stuff. So I think it's the self-awareness piece. I've never ever really, it's organic, it's authentic, it's transparent, it's honest. I think that would be my kind of, I guess, 20 or 30 years in this world, which has helped me kind of shape a level of understanding of the right contextual behaviors for specific environments and specific challenges. To that, I know that might
Yeah.
not quite hit the nail on the head
No, that.
specifically, but I think that's the catalyst for, understanding myself, which then allows me to sort of come at other people's problems or other people's challenges with I guess empathy and a level of, I guess, understanding that we all do have a map of the world, and maybe mine and yours don't necessarily always align, but there is going to be commonality.
Yeah. I mean, it takes a lot of maturity and humility and self-accountability to go through that process that you've described of kind of really identifying the areas that you need to keep in check, like a fiery temper, and then being willing to work on it. Because you and I have all worked with people who have managed to get to senior positions, and they haven't worked on some of their glaring weaknesses, and it kind of creates a bit of a path of destruction. And so I guess my question is, and it's a bit of a personal question. Like, what was it that happened in your life or in you that actually made you want to work on yourself? Because not everyone does. I know it sounds obvious, but some people will work on the easy stuff, but won't work on the hard things that they don't really want to change. But you've obviously been willing to work on the hard things. What was it that happened, or what light bulb came on that made you want to do that?
Yeah, great question, Pete. And yeah, I don't mind answering a personal question. I mean, from my perspective, there's lots of different things that you end up meeting at this particular moment and juncture. I guess one of them would be, and it goes back to Paddy Upton and it goes back to personal mastery. In terms of the pursuit of excellence is going to never end, and having the humility to understand, and you use the word humility as well, that having the humility to understand that in terms of the pursuit of excellence, it's never going to end. I'll give you the exact moment. I went to Altus, Altus, the guys out
Yeah.
in Arizona. Anyway, I went out to Altus for some professional development, 2015, and I heard Dan Paff speak, and I saw Dan Paff present a presentation on athletic development and various other things. And anyway, within that presentation, and Dan's probably 20 something years older than me, within that presentation, Dan blew my mind with some technical kind of accomplishments and his coaching eye. And I just thought, oh my God. And I would have been 40 at the time. Yeah, whatever, doesn't matter. Yeah, about that. And I was like, he just blew my mind. And I just realized then that I knew so little about performance compared with, Yoda of athletics and track and field particularly. And I guess it's just that accomplishment or that all-encompassing, I guess, philosophy, Pete, that I want to be known in the industry as like an accomplished performance coach. But I also know, and I also have the humility to understand that the field is so broad that I'll never be an expert in everything, and I don't necessarily want to be perceived as an expert in everything, but I do want to continually work on myself to be as good as I can be for as long as I can be, because that has impact on the people that I serve and the people I work with. And as a coach, first and foremost, in my kind of DNA, I know that my personal why is about supporting other people so that they can accomplish the extraordinary things. And I guess that's just that kind of, that mindset that I have and I've taken for probably the last 10 years at least into my kind of professional relationships and my workplace kind of, goals, and trying to accomplish as much as I can, but in the medium of coaching and obviously leadership as part of that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's clear that you've identified your personal why, which is a really good starting point, to support others to accomplish extraordinary things is a great kind of tagline. I absolutely love that. And but not everyone identifies their personal why, I guess, and which is one of the reasons why they may never really go deep enough on that route of self-development, self-understanding, emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and so on. So, yeah, great that you've kind of set yourself out on that route, and it's evident in what you've achieved and what you've done that you've been very successful in that.
I'm
Just as
hanging on,
we
Pete. I'm
close,
hanging on. I mean,
you do.
I do no, but on a serious note, Pete, I'm in the performance industry. I've been in the performance industry all of my career, and I am aware that there are people who drop off the face of performance coaching way before they get to 30 years in the industry for lots of different reasons.
Mm.
But it's one of those ones. Just going back to it quickly. One of my roles is to understand, the player why or the athlete why, the person who's standing in front of you. Well, why are you here and what can I do for you? And that was exactly the same thing that I did for myself. Me, like you said, you've paraphrased it or you've summarized it perfectly. My why helps other people accomplish extraordinary things, and that is servant leadership. But to the point of having the backbone to mutually own performance, and I'll quote Jeremy Shepherd, who's he's a key influence of mine when it comes to how he approaches building performance frameworks and obviously coaching extraordinary people in the fields that he's worked in. But it is about two people owning performance, but in real terms. And people like Sam Warburton, he's always a name that comes up in podcasts when I do it. Sam owned his performance. Other extraordinary players own their performance, and support staff absolutely have a part to play in their development. But all the best, all the very best, own their own performance with the help of others. And it's not my program that was the difference between Sam becoming a British Lion and not. It was his diligence and ability to do extraordinary things that other people are not prepared to do, which allowed him to be 2 times Lions, captain, and all the other things that go along with that. And that I'm sure there's a ton of sports people that you've coached in your life that have got exactly the same traits and qualities. And part of our job as support staff and leaders is to tease out the best in those people. And there's a ton of frameworks and there's a ton of models that can allow you to do that. But I think the connection is a key one, and the human side of human performance will still sit for me at the heart of all interactions that allow for meaningful kind of outcomes when it comes to high performing humans. We talked offline about AI,
Absolutely.
mate. We talked offline about AI. AI will not, and I'll die on this hill, will not replace humans when it comes to coaching. Will not replace humans when it comes to coaching. We're too complex for that.
Yeah.
That's my
No,
two
I agree.
cents.
And there's lots of discussion even on the tech. Sorry, I think I spoke over you, but there was a delay on the line. But there seems to be a lot of discussion even on the tech side, that people on the machine side, the technical side, realize that they can't replace humans, and they're not trying to. And it's good to hear that they understand that, because we work on the human side and we can see that. But yeah, it's a good point you make. I think one of the things that has really stuck out from this conversation is your commitment to your life's calling, your vocation of working in performance and helping people. And I've heard that from a number of sports leaders that I've interviewed, that yes, they could easily walk away and go earn loads of money doing something else, but they choose not to, because they are absolutely committed to this cause. And I find that fascinating, interesting, and you've kind of echoed the same thing. You're like, this is my life commitment. I'm kind of working in performance. That's what I want to do. So it's interesting hearing that. But just as we wrap up, I really appreciate your time, really appreciate your thoughts and insights. I've taken so many notes. I'm sure that our listeners will have found some real gems in there. But is there anything you want to end with? Any closing comments or thoughts or reflections that you can leave us with?
I think the word reflections absolutely sits right at the centre of personal development. And I think one of the things that, like I say, it took me a long time to, I guess, adopt reflective practice. And I'll thank a guy called Professor Brendan Cropley for kind of really encouraging me to be better at that particular element of personal development. If there's one lesson for young listeners or young coaches or anybody who's wanting to look at a long journey of personal development, I've gained huge value from reflective practice and taking the time to, I guess, understand what I've done well, understand what I could have done better, sort, I guess, feedback so that I could enhance my performance for future programming or for future, coach development sessions or whatever that might be. I guess, Pete, to answer the question succinctly, reflective practice has been a very, very powerful, personal development tool. And I would encourage every young coach who's working in performance to either seek out good mentorship or start, if they haven't started already, taking reflective practice seriously, because it will be a sort of growth accelerator. That would be my kind of key takeaway for the listening group. Hopefully
No,
so.
that's fantastic.
Hopefully they're still listening nearly an hour in.
I'm sure they are. I love that growth accelerator term. That's a good one. And like you said, reflective practice is so key. Just as we end, I think one of the things I've learned most from you, and you won't even know this, but is your ability to build a network is absolutely phenomenal. You've probably got the biggest network out of anyone I know in this field, and I think you can't underestimate the importance of that and the power of that. And that's one of my closing comments for the listeners. Toomsy's got the biggest network ever, and I think there's a lot to be learnt from that. I've certainly taken a lot away from that, and I've I place it at high importance in my life to have a good network. So thanks for that. I know you didn't even realize I learned that from you, but that's something I've kind of observed. So
No, thanks, Pete. But do you know where that comes from? The heart of that. One, it's organic and it's authentic. But two,
yeah,
it's about the connection and the relationships that you have, and that comes from that kind of inner coach, which is build connection and build genuine connection. And I've never ever built network just for sort of personal gain. It's much more
yeah,
about sharing knowledge, exchanging ideas, trying my very best to offer an ear. As much as me wanting to take something from an interaction, it's as much me wanting to give in that interaction as well. And I think that genuine kind of authentic drive to build network is valuable. It's not insincere. It's not, can I kind of build a network with someone of influence so that I can then leverage that down the line. It's much more about the two-way
yeah,
street, much more about a give and take. And I
yeah.
really just on that, one of my biggest bugbears when I get cold calls via LinkedIn or other social platforms is, can I pick your brain? That's the
Mm.
word. That's my least favorite phrase in the world. No, not knowledge exchange is a two-way street. So whoever's asking, can I pick your brain? Try and reframe that as best you can, which basically means, what can I do for you before I ask you for something?
Brilliant, brilliant.
Anyway,
You know
don't want to end on a negative. Let's ask me something else.
no. No, no, that's absolutely a positive to end on because I think, people can misunderstand, what I said about the power of network and go, right, let's just network with everyone because, I can use all these people for, whatever end I want. But actually, you've kind of come in and said, well, no, it's about connection and it's about relationship and it's authentic. And I think that is such a good point to end on because that's why you have a good network. It's not just because you want to have loads of people you can call for help. No, it's that you're genuinely connected with a lot of people and you have a lot of relationships. So I think that's a great point to end on. Chris, just want to say thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you face to face at some point soon, hopefully.
You bet. Thanks, Pete. I've really enjoyed it.